this week's reflections based on a passage from Luke chapter 21, verses 25 to 36. It's actually quite a difficult passage, and it's unusual to have a passage which is talking about the end of time. It's unusual to have that at a time when we start to think about Jesus coming into the world as a baby. But it talks about a time when they would see that there would be signs in the heavens of a time of great terror that was coming, and also says that this generation will still be here when this happens. If we're thinking in terms of Jesus coming, or second coming, and the end of the world, then this passage doesn't make sense because it's 2,000 years has gone, and he's talking about a period of a generation. So what's it saying? We need to think back to last week, and last week Jesus said to the disciples that this beautiful temple, this magnificent building, there wouldn't be a stone left of it. And that sort of stunned the disciples a bit. But he'd also been talking about the teachers of the law and how they put on this wonderful show and looked very pious, but actually inside they were quite corrupt and greedy. And so same with the temple, he said, the temple is magnificent, but what's going on inside it just is not honouring to God. And so the time's coming when this temple is just going to be destroyed. Naturally, the disciples' question is, well, when? When is this going to happen? And so Jesus began to warn them of terrible times that were coming. He began to tell them to be alert to the signs. And then he gave them an example. He said, look, there are fig trees everywhere. Now you know that when you see the first fresh leaves on a fig tree, you know that summer's coming. So you can read those signs. Well, I need you to read these signs. And he went on to tell them. But at the same time, he's saying, but don't be afraid, because it is the work of God. In verse 32, he says, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Now, a generation in biblical times was known as about 40 years. And indeed, in 40 years' time, terrible things did happen. There were some Jewish zealots who rebelled against Rome, and Rome came in against them with great force. The Jewish historian Josephus gives very detailed description of the war between the Romans and the Jews. And they besieged Jerusalem. And in that siege, of course, no food gets in. That's the idea of a siege, to starve the people out. But things inside the city just became horrendous. There were two groups who were fighting each other. There were thugs who went around and they would just burst into people's houses and take the food off their table and even torture them to see if there was any hidden food anywhere. And the death toll was so terrible that there were just corpses lying in the street because there were just too many to bury, and the stench became unbearable. So 70 AD, about 40 years from the time that Jesus predicted this, Rome eventually entered the city, and most of the zealots who were still alive had gone to the temple for refuge, and so Rome just completely sacked the temple and burnt it to the ground. And all the people were taken into captivity and scattered right throughout different nations. But what about the signs he talked of? Well, again, the Jewish historian gives us an account of what was experienced before this terrible war, and there were some amazing things that were seen. There was a star, the shape of a sword, that hung over Jerusalem, and there was a comet that stayed there for a year. And then they had a strange phenomenon in the temple. It was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and about 9 o'clock at night, this huge light shone around the altar. It was so bright, it was sort of brighter than daylight, and it lasted for about half an hour. And then about midnight of that same time, some of the people in charge of the temple came and said, the east gate has just opened of its own accord now. This gate was a huge bronze gate. It took 20 men to open or close it. And when it was closed, it was bolted into stone in the ground. It opened of its own accord. People who knew their scriptures could probably have picked up a similarity to a vision of Ezekiel in the 6th century BC. Ezekiel had a vision where he saw God hovering over the temple, but then he left the temple. He went into the outer court and then through the east gate. And what it was God was showing Ezekiel the terrible things that were going to happen because he was leaving or taking away his protective presence from the people and letting them take the consequence of what they'd been doing, which has been that they'd been worshipping other gods in the temple. They'd been completely disobedient to God. And so, of course, once God withdrew his protection, then the Babylonian army came in, and that's when they sacked that first temple and took the people off into captivity in Babylon. Now, the judgment of God is coming again on a people who had rejected the Son of God. They'd cast him as a criminal and they'd executed him. So what they were really saying, this was not God. Jesus was God among them, and yet they're saying he's not God. And so Jesus is saying about coming in a cloud. Josephus tells us again in his history, a few days after the feast, that there was an incredible phenomenon. He says, I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those who saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For, before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armour were seen running about among the clouds and the surrounding of cities. And then he recounts another phenomenon. He said, at that feast, which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as was their custom, to perform the sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking and heard a great noise. And after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, let us remove hence. The Son of Man, Jesus, had indeed come on the clouds, but this time he came in judgment. Now it isn't that God inflicted judgment on the people, but he was removing his protective presence, and that allowed them to suffer the natural consequences of the choices they were making. What this passage says to us is that the consequences of disobedience to God are terrible. The nation had rejected God, and so God withdrew his presence from among them, allowed these terrible things to happen. One day Jesus will come again and the earth will be judged. We don't know when it will be, but we are told to remain alert and not slip into careless and godless ways, because the day will come as a surprise. The time we don't know. There's also a warning to us that the time of our departure from this earth we don't know. Could be tomorrow, could be today. When we do leave, we're either going to be with Jesus because we have been his followers, or we're going to be outside of the presence of God. And being outside of the presence of God is a terrible place to be. That's what we're choosing now as we live this life here. Where are we going to spend eternity?